It's a very old story in Greek mythology about a sculptor named Pygmalion.
Oh, yes.
And Pygmalion was very skilled and created this sculpture of a woman. And it was so perfect that he actually fell in love with the statue. And, long story short, prayed to the love god Venus, and Venus took pity on poor Pygmalion.
Oh, my goddess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the Venus granted his wish and actually made the sculpture real. So it's kind of a story about the power of a self-fulfilling expectation.
It's like the first Pinocchio.
Right. Actually, Pinocchio is a bit of a take on this particular story.
I never thought about that before.
Yeah, it really is. This is actually a concept called the Pygmalion Effect, and it is all about the power of a self-fulfilling expectation. It was created. It's also sometimes called, I think, the Rosenthal effect, but that's a little boring, so nobody refers to it that way. The Pygmalion effect actually has a lot to do with how an authority figure, whether it is a manager or a leader or a teacher or some other person who's in a position of authority, how they respond or how they interact with a subordinate. And what they've found, and this has been corroborated in many studies, is that if a leader has, or an authority figure has high expectations for the people they're leading, those subordinates or the people who are working or whatever tend to perform up to that level of expectation. If the leader has low expectations, the performance of those being led tends to be similarly low.
Yeah, doesn't Carnegie say something like give someone like a splendid reputation to live up to?
Exactly.
Something like that?
That's a very concise, simple way of stating the Pygmalion effect.
I like that.
And so this is really interesting because as a leader, you'll get more out of, or as a manager, or someone who is trying to organize a group of people and all move them in the same direction, you'll get far more. You'll get better work, more work. Pretty much everything across the board will be better if you have high expectations of the people you work with.
Yeah.
Which is basically give people a good reputation to live up to, and they will try to meet or exceed your expectation.
Yeah.
Now, this isn't carte blanche to
Expect
set,
the moon.
set unrealistic expectations or expectations that are beyond the abilities or the strengths of the people that you're leading. So, if you're the CEO of a car company, you can't say to your head engineer, create and build a new car, I want to test drive it tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. There's certainly some planning and things take a certain amount of time.
Sure.
But the higher the expectation that you have of those people, the better they'll perform for you. Now, this is very interesting because it also intersects with contrast and the expectation effect. Okay, so there's an interaction going on here. Remember the expectation effect of quality equals performance minus expectations?
Yes. Oh, yes.
The higher the expectations you have for people, the higher they'll perform. But the higher the expectations you have, the more likely it is you'll be disappointed in their performance. Okay, so there's an interesting cycle happening here, right? What happens if a manager has two employees, one that they have very high expectations of, and one they have low expectations of? And the one who they have high expectations of performs really well, but it's below the expectation.
Right.
Whereas the one who they have low expectations of outperforms that.
Right. But it's still lower than the other guy. But it's still
lower than the other. It's a very interesting interaction here. And if you look at it, and we're contrasting two people here, so contrast principle definitely applies.
Right.
It's actually more likely that the manager would think more highly of the person who performed worse than the one who actually performed better in the absolute because of the expectation effect. So this is something that as a leader or as a manager, you can use to your benefit of making sure that you have very high expectations for people and they know it. That's part of the Pygmalion effect. They have to know that you are expecting a lot of them. It's part of the deal.
Right. Well, and I think that they don't always have to, only because in this book that I was reading, the Skinner book, they were discussing this. They were discussing the study done in the 70s where children were given, and it was supposedly an IQ test, but it really was totally bunk. And then at random, and the children didn't, this is why I even mentioned this, because the children didn't know what they got. But the teachers were told who supposedly measured very, very highly on this and who didn't. And so then just by the way the teachers interacted with the children, when the researchers came back a year later, those children who they had randomly said were going to achieve more and higher things because of maybe the attention they were getting from the teachers or the expectations or the extra whatever, they did. So I think maybe it depends on the interaction, but the person doesn't necessarily have to know, I think you're going to achieve X.
They don't have to, but it always helps if they're going to strive to reach the level of an expectation. It helps if they understand what the expectation is.
Totally.
And part of this study was, you know, it's like the teacher was influencing how people actually responded.
Yeah.
So that's part, you know, the leader's expectation is just as important as the expectation of the people who are doing this thing. But, you know, it's interesting because it's something that you can use to have high expectations for people, so you treat them as if you have high expectations,
and then inhibit yourself,
and then also inhibit yourself, so you can compare things in the absolute where it actually makes sense, instead of this weird interaction with the expectation effect. So that is the Pygmalion effect, and if you want to get the most out of your people, it's worth paying attention to.